Professor Noora and I'm Kaija Schilde, are going to welcome you to the beginning of this event. We're terribly excited, and actually I'm most nervous about making sure I thank everyone who's involved. That's my big job. I was taking it seriously, and because this is such a big interdisciplinary event involving Boston University and beyond. So the main organization hosting this event is the Boston University Forced Migration Human Trafficking Initiative. And this initiative, started by my colleague Noora 3 years ago, is an interdisciplinary initiative across Boston University that brings together people from the Global Studies School, from the law school, from the medical school, from sociology and public health and the dental school and engineering and everywhere together to study the topics of migration and human trafficking. And so this by itself is terribly exciting. But in addition to this topic, we have also, for this conference, we have sponsors including the European Union, Erasmus Plus, Jean Monnet program. We also have a sponsor of Thomson Reuters and the Boston Consortium for Arab Region Studies. And inside Boston University, we have partners including the BU Buzz Lab, which is the entrepreneurship and innovation hub here at Boston University. We have sponsors of the Boston University School of Law, the Global Programs and Study Abroad program. I want to thank Leilani Olson for her involvement in that. We also have the BU Alumni Office involved in this event, and Sarah Seitz has been key in that. We also have the African Studies Center, the Initiative on Cities, the Center for the Study of Europe, the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs, the Institute for the Study of Muslim Societies and Civilizations, Global Lawyers and Physicians Working Together for Human Rights, NGO, the BU Center for Computational Science, the Hariri Center, including the BU Spark Initiative and Ziba Cranmer. We have the Center for Health Law, Ethics, and Human Rights, the Boston Center for Refugee Health and Human Rights, Latin America Studies. We also have our forced migration human trafficking staff, including Claire Coffey, the program manager for this event, Samantha Robertson, the director of the forced migration human trafficking staff, and all the forced migration human trafficking interns. So you see why I was nervous about getting all that out. Now that I have that out, I feel so good. But I just want to actually give everyone a round of applause first who's involved in this. Thank you. All right, so there's a lot of ideas that are coming into this and a lot of different people, and we're so excited to have such a innovative, unique kind of conference going on. The Forced Migration Human Trafficking Initiative, as I said, was founded 3 years ago by my colleague, and it was supposed to bring together interdisciplinary resources and expertise. It's supposed to be academic, but it's also supposed to be about policy, and the biggest innovation in it is it's supposed to be about solutions. It is not supposed to be academics sitting around talking about problems. And so this was what every event, every initiative, and every part of the Forced Migration Human Trafficking Initiative is supposed to be about. And so for the last 3 years, we've been just kind of reacting to events on the ground. We've been having town halls about the travel ban. We've been hosting events about migration resettlement, migration management. We've been having student-led events about trafficking, connecting students and the university across Boston University and also to NGOs and civil society. So that's what we've been doing. But we sat down and we realized, actually, that the two topics of forced migration and human trafficking, we didn't really actually integrate those two topics. We siloed them completely separately. We were either talking about migration or we were talking about trafficking. And this is actually, we realized it wasn't just us, it was the field. That we rarely talk about trafficking and migration together. And I know that the people in the world who actually talk about the two things together are sitting in this room right now, so please don't be offended, but rarely does one talk about migration and trafficking together. So we realized we were lacking in that way, and we realized this conversation was lacking. And there's a lot of different reasons why this is the case. Migration is visible. It's happening across borders. It's happening on the news. Trafficking is invisible. It's happening in alleys or online, right? Migration is happening often at different levels than trafficking. Migration is happening at a global transnational scale. It's happening, crossing borders. And migration is dependent on citizenship, which happens at the level of the state.
That's our transition. So as you can tell, we're on a tight schedule, and we are applying it to ourselves. So everyone has exactly 5 minutes, which I know some of you got that email and thought, this woman must be crazy. How can I possibly say something in 5 minutes? But I think that, especially, we're in a huge lecture hall. Academia is kind of a space where you often get lectured at, and there isn't that common interaction with both the audience and other panelists. So you end up going to conferences where you're learning a ton and you want to actually be able to engage with people, but can't because so much of it is formalized lectures. So for the rest of the program, including now I'm cutting into my 5 minutes, everyone is going to have 5 minutes. At the end of the 5-minute mark, there'll be a little bell. You'll have a 2-minute grace period. And at the end of the grace period, the bell will just keep going until you stop talking. And it's not actually a way of silencing you. It's actually a way of building in more time for discussion. And so with that, I'm going to give a very brief intro and just say that, thinking about forced migration, human trafficking, I think Kaija already talked about some of the reasons that we don't think of them together. One of the main reasons I think that we don't think of them together is because forced migration is seen as something that is crisis-driven, whereas trafficking is business as usual. And we have to think about how there's now a business around forced migration and displacement. As Kaija mentioned, if the goal was always to be interdisciplinary, because the idea was that you could never think of solutions within one discipline. You can define problems really well and talk about alternative explanations of why a problem exists in the way that it does, but you can't actually come up with solutions interdisciplinarily, unless you're bringing in other fields. And you also can't do that if you're working only within the university. And that's why a lot of our guests during this conference are not academics, and they're actually either in the private sector or they're from community centers or NGOs, and they work on the ground on these issues. So we're really excited to invite all of you equally. One experiment that came out of this approach of thinking about solutions was a teaching experiment. And I taught a class on forced migration and human trafficking where I gave the students, who are all women, by the way, 25 women, a challenge. And that challenge was the output for policy classes is usually a written policy recommendation that nobody reads. So what would you design? Like if you were actually thinking about this problem, what would you design for refugees on the ground or the NGOs and local municipalities that support them? What kind of blueprint, what kind of digital tool or database would you design? And my aspirations for the class was just to make myself start thinking in terms of solutions and to engage students in a way that thinks about solutions. And it actually, what ended up happening exceeded all of my expectations. The students focused in on Jordan, and they focused specifically on a problem that we see. As you move from the camp setting to the urban setting, there's a major drop in access to aid. So things like vaccination rates, education rates drop. And this is paradoxical because in the camp setting, you actually have a smaller infrastructure. You have one clinic or a couple of schools, but people know where they are. And in the urban setting, you have more, but people can't get to them. So what the students came up with was a simple app mapping system. And they designed an app, and Microsoft ended up building it for us pro bono. So we have a 2-minute video that will definitely get me a bell, but I will show it anyway.
Many of my people's life were ripped apart because of the fighting in Syria. Some fled to cities in Jordan without jobs, abandoned, alone, except for one thing: access to a cell phone.
The cell phone has become a literal lifeline. Urban Refuge is an app for refugees who are living in Jordan currently. That's our first test market. And what the app does is that it locates aid on a map. Sounds like a very simple idea, but it's actually very powerful because there is no comprehensive, accessible database of aid locations for refugees. And so what the app actually does is it simply maps this out in a very easy to understand format, Arabic, English, other languages, and it makes it so that refugees actually can choose what aid they access.
It's giving them the right to choose, which is something that doesn't really happen too often when you're a refugee, because part of it is that a lot of choices are made for you. And this is bringing back agency to you. You can find exactly what you're looking for. You can do it instead of it just coming down from the top.
We started with people, we turned it into data, and then we moved from that to actually people again.
We've built a Xamarin application that works on Android and iOS. It talks to a backend web service in Azure that then talks to a SQL database that stores all the information.
It's modular enough that I can share my code and have a native app for iOS, Android, and Windows. And for the localization piece as well, I can have all of that code and all of those resources for different languages in one folder, one file, one code base, one code set, and I can just promote that to each platform.
I don't have to be a software engineer to have ideas about what I want software to do, and just having someone who's a really good listener and understands our project and constantly looked for feedback from me was amazing, because we got the app that we dreamed of.
We are not just refugees. We are doctors and lawyers, engineers. So if you really want to help Syrian people, start thinking about them as people, not just only refugees.
It's amazing to see so much passion and be able to take that and translate it into technology that's going to change people's lives.
So I went over.
So I don't mind being the guinea pig showing that we really mean it with the 5-minute bell. I had some really fun points to make about the distinctions between human trafficking and migration, but basically those points will be made over the next 2 days, talking about the intersection of these two very important issues. So what I wanted to finish, and I didn't manage my time properly, was I wanted to pivot to saying that one of the ways in which we have been thinking about these issues is by interacting with students and by harnessing student energy, specifically in courses in curricular and co-curricular activities. So Noora's class, the Urban Refuge Project, was the first of this kind. I then taught a class and had a student group that took on a very similar challenge, but in Europe, specifically trying to understand the issue of unaccompanied minors in Europe. And so that was an issue that was the intersection of trafficking and migration, because the presence of unaccompanied minors in Europe was a result of forced migration, but their plight was one that involved all sorts of issues around trafficking. And so we attempted to take on a similar challenge of could we have some kind of policy intervention. And at risk of getting the bell, I will not tell the whole story, but the solution found us, specifically in the form of the closure of the Calais camp in northern France almost a year ago, a few days ago, and where NGOs that worked with youth center NGOs said, you know, we have a check-in system where we work with 1,200 kids, and it's a face-to-face check-in system, and the camp's going to get raised, and then how do we check in with them? And they said, can you provide any kind of system or solution? We don't care what it is, whether it's a phone tree or whatever. Can you help us? And so my class worked really, really hard. We dropped everything and worked hard for a few weeks to innovate a solution. It wasn't an app. Why? Because nobody had smartphones in that situation. And that was one of the first challenges we faced. So we created a mass texting platform to try to address that issue of communication between NGOs and the kids. And my class this year is taking on part of that project and trying to shepherd it beyond just a pilot project. And what I wanted to do in my 5 minutes before was to ask everyone who either has been in that class or is affiliated with Urban Refuge or is a forced migration human trafficking intern here at Boston University. I wanted to make visible all the students in the room. Can you please stand up? Fantastic. So I'm glad I got a chance to do that. And that was basically all we wanted to say.
Are we under?
We're under. We have 15 seconds.
Okay.
So we wanted to make sure that I'm the first one who got embarrassed by the bell, but at least I got out all my thank yous, which was the most important part.